MMA matchmakers don't always get it right. Donald Cerrone versus Conor McGregor. Take their decision to book Donald Cowboy Cerrone in for a showdown with Conor McGregor, for example. Now, of course, on paper, it would be good to see fighters getting more tune-up fights than the current climate in the sport allows. But anyone who thought that Cerrone would be anything other than an easy night out for the Irishman was mad. Conor went out there and ran through Cowboy with ease, scoring a head kick on Cerrone in the opening 30 seconds that led him to eventually landing a series of hard shots for the finish. We all love Cowboy, don't get us wrong, but this 40-second matchup was truly a waste of time. It was nice to see Donald get a huge paycheck, but that was pretty much the only positive thing you can say about this one. CM Punk versus Mickey Gall. The UFC enjoy making a quick buck as much as anyone, but the idea that the aging pro wrestler CM Punk could be anything other than an easy win for a fighter like Mickey Gall was kinda crazy. Punk was a world-famous member of the WWE for years, but actual fighting takes a different level of skill and talent entirely. And for him, in his mid-30s, to step into the UFC and try to compete with a legitimate BJJ brown belt who had decent potential, yeah, this was never going to end well. And sure enough, it did not take long for Punk to get found out in a big way. Gall got the takedown almost immediately, grounding his opponent with no real issues before landing strikes and eventually securing an easy win. Punk was just not up to the challenge of beating anyone who could hold a place on the UFC roster. Chan Sung Yoon versus Max Holloway. Seeing Chan Sung Yoon get such a rapturous response for his final ever UFC walkout was pretty amazing to watch live. But that's just about the best thing you can say about the decision to match him up with the great Max Holloway. Now, in the end, this fight was actually a lot more fun than anyone could have predicted. But man, did we really need to see the Korean zombie getting sparked like that? After all of the insane performances this man has turned in over the years, seeing him leave the sport by getting KO'd at the hands of Max Holloway was not pretty. But despite Holloway not being known for his power, he laid out Zombie with a huge overhand punch to get the win. All in all, this fight was kinda needless and didn't tell us anything new about Holloway's position within the 145-pound title race. Remember, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single upload. Stephen Bonner versus Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva was so dominant as middleweight champion that he used to take fights up at 205 pounds because, well, he could. And when he found himself in the cage with Stephen Bonner, it became very clear very early on that Silva had absolutely nothing to fear from Bonner's striking. So much so that he was very comfortable toying with Bonner, messing around with the TUF finalist, showing clear disdain for his striking skills. This went on for close to a full round until Silva decided to go for the kill, kneeing Bonner up the middle with a huge shot for the easiest win of his career. Chuck Liddell versus Tito Ortiz 3. This might be the single worst matchmaking decision in MMA history, but it didn't happen within the UFC, which does soften the blow to some degree. Chuck Liddell had been retired for 8 years before Oscar De La Hoya and Tito Ortiz worked together to bring him out of retirement. Tito, who had lost to Liddell twice in his prime, coaxed the Iceman into the cage for one more fight with Golden Boy behind him, knowing that he was the fresher, more active fighter between the two of them. And that made this one truly ugly viewing experience. Chuck hadn't fought in close to a decade and it showed. He looked awkward, lost, and totally unable to take Ortiz's first big punch, one that dropped him to the canvas for an easy TKO win for the Huntington Beach bad boy. And the way he celebrated like he had just won UFC gold afterwards, a terrible event for the sport. Chael Sonnen versus Jon Jones. Sure, having a season of The Ultimate Fighter with these two superstars made a hell of a lot of sense, but who in their right mind could ever fathom the idea of Chael Sonnen actually beating Jon Jones? Seriously, this was just never going to happen. And on fight night, despite Jon having a broken toe he sustained midway through this one, he still managed to TKO Chael in that opening round before the doctors could notice it. Jones was so tuned into the task at hand that he didn't even realize that he was just seconds away from losing his title by default. Chael was a solid middleweight in his heyday, sure, but going up against the 205-pound GOAT? Yeah, this fight was only ever going one way for Sonnen. Beth Correia versus Ronda Rousey. Beth Correia is one of the most widely ridiculed fighters in women's MMA history. Not only did she make herself look extremely foolish by taunting Holly Holm just seconds before getting kicked in the head, but when she took on Ronda Rousey, it was an even greater embarrassment. First of all, she barely deserved this fight in the first place, getting her shot at the champ on the back of a very light resume. And when she did find herself signing on the dotted line for a title shot, she tried to make an enemy of Rousey by mocking her deceased father. By the time the bout itself came around, pretty much everyone was on Team Ronda, and sure enough, Rousey did not disappoint, scoring an easy TKO in less than a minute to make us wonder why the UFC even bothered putting this one together. Royce Gracie versus Matt Hughes. The first late-career Royce Gracie fight that we'll be featuring in this video came during his return to the UFC to take on the great Matt Hughes. Why the UFC decided to put a fight this unbalanced on is anyone's guess, because Hughes was very clearly the more informed fighter of the two, still in his prime and possessing a far more modern skill set than his opponent. Gracie, despite being a legendary BJJ fighter, was easily dominated by Hughes on fight night, even on the mat where he was expected to have an advantage. In less than a round, Hughes was proving his superiority, eventually pounding Royce out after threatening with a submission of his own. At the time, this became the highest-selling UFC pay-per-view of all time, so it wasn't necessarily a mistake in every way, but this was not a fight of any real consequence. Ken Shamrock vs. Royce Gracie 3. No one needed to see a version of Ken Shamrock in his early 50s taking on a long-retired 48-year-old Royce Gracie. But Scott Coker and Bellator seemed to think that this was an opportunity to make some money off of a legendary 1990s rivalry. But this fight was as sloppy and terrible as anything you'll ever see in the sport. Gracie landed a low knee on Shamrock almost immediately, hitting him in the groin and causing him to fall over. He then proceeded to TKO his great rival before anyone really knew what had happened. Just a totally stupid fight to ever book, with an even worse end result. James Toney vs. Randy Couture. And finally, we come to a bout that was even worse than CM Punk vs. Mickey Gall. In fact, we'd go as far as to say that it made that welterweight clash look elite by comparison, because at least Punk had the good sense to train in MMA for some time before jumping into the UFC. James Toney literally only got himself into the UFC by blasting the entire sport of MMA, taking shots at mixed martial arts and calling it a far inferior fighting system to boxing. And so Dana White, who's always ready to answer a challenge from the sweet science, decided to match Toney up with the 5-time UFC champion Randy Couture. And yeah, this fight went exactly as you might expect. Couture knew that Toney didn't have an ounce of respect for BJJ or any form of ground fighting style, and so he simply took him down and proceeded to score an easy win. Toney's boxing is legendary, sure, but in an MMA cage, it was rendered totally ineffective.